Since 2014, conflicts in the Middle East and Africa have brought around 1.8 million people to Europe's door. The bloc has been unable to come up with a solution, blaming each other for inaction or lack of support. Has this debate revealed deeper conflicts? Could the renewed tensions cause irreparable damage to the European Union? You're watching Roundtable with me, Shuli Ghosh. EU leaders met at an informal summit on the weekend to see if they could resolve differences over the migrant crisis. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said it produced a lot of goodwill. But the debate has been festering for years and achieved little except highlight the cracks forming in the EU's shared foundation.
Europe's migrant crisis has created the continent's biggest influx of refugees since World War II. Conflicts in the Middle East and Africa have brought approximately 1.8 million people since 2014. How Europe has responded to the crisis is a hot political issue, and one that's dividing the EU. Is it revealing deeper conflicts within the bloc? A political spat over a migrant rescue ship in the Mediterranean Sea has yet again highlighted Europe's immigration policies. Italy refused to allow the Aquarius, with over 600 people on board, to dock at any of its ports. Malta also refused, leaving Spain to eventually grant it access. The incident drew harsh criticism from France.
C'est, monsieur le député, l'Italie qui devrait, en la matière, assurer ses responsabilités. Elle a choisi de ne pas le faire. Elle a choisi de ne pas le faire et donc de méconnaître les obligations internationales qui lui incombent.
Italy's new right-wing government hit back, saying it's done its fair share.
Il problema è che la nostra storia di solidarietà, generosità e volontariato non merita di essere apostrofata con alcuni termini da parte di qualche esponente del governo francese.
Under EU law, migrants must apply for asylum in the first country they arrive in. But geography alone means countries like Italy, Greece and Spain are always targeted by those escaping Africa and the Middle East. Last year, Italy struck a deal with Libya to help curb the numbers of migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea. It provides support to the Libyan Coast Guard to push back boats before they enter Italian waters, but that has raised humanitarian concerns. 3 years since the height of the crisis, are the ongoing squabbles creating deeper divisions between Europe's biggest players? Germany's Angela Merkel wants a united EU response to the crisis. She already has France's support and Spain's new centre-left government.
Esta es una política que solamente vamos a poder resolver desde el punto de vista comunitario, europeo, con una política migratoria común.
But Hungary, the Czech Republic and Poland are against an even spread of asylum seekers. And as demonstrated with the Aquarius, Malta and Italy are becoming increasingly reluctant to help too. Migration was a key issue behind Britain's vote to leave the bloc in 2016. Is anti-immigration sentiment threatening the shared foundation of the EU? Where does the responsibility lie for individual nations? And is the failure to find a solution further undermining the unified strength of the EU?
Well, joining us now from Oslo is Paul Nesse, Senior Advisor to the Norwegian Refugee Council. In the studio with me is Robert Oulds, Director of the Bruges Club, a eurosceptic think tank, Elisa Pieri, Amnesty International's Western Europe researcher, and Russell Foster, an EU politics analyst at King's College in London. Good to have you all with us. I think it's clear that the immigration is exposing some key divisions among EU members. Russell, not likely that they're going to reach a consensus despite yet another summit upcoming on this issue.
No, this has been an issue which has been going on since 2014 at least. Now, at the weekend, there was a large EU summit of heads of state, which the British didn't attend, where the basic premise was an agreement to disagree. We did get some boilerplate rhetoric from Angela Merkel on how we're seeing a sense of moving forward, but nothing
there was
concrete.
goodwill.
Exactly. There is nothing but a lack of goodwill. The meeting was a damp squib, and instead we've seen that it's exposed the divisions within European countries and the divisions between Europeans. We're seeing a split between the Mediterranean nations, which are geographically closest to the migrant routes, the northwestern European countries, which are tired of having to fund bailouts and refugee programs in the Mediterranean, and the post-Soviet states, who take almost no refugees but are making the most noise about migration into Europe. So the conference did nothing but expose the worsening divisions within the Union.
And presumably you'd agree with that, and the fact that immigration as an issue has shaped European politics for the last couple of years now.
Well, yes, one of the key driving issues. It's not just for the last couple of years. This has been bubbling away under the surface, ignored by politicians, particularly at the EU level, for decades now. This issue was a major issue in the UK going back to the early 2000s and was one of the driving forces, not the main driving force, behind the Brexit vote in 2016, 2 years ago now. So this has been ignored by politicians, it hasn't been tackled, and it's continuing to drive divisions.
And seems to be coming to a crunch point where you have 600 migrants turned away from Italy's port. Italy saying that it has every right to do that because it is receiving the brunt, the bulk of these refugees.
Yes, first arrival countries are receiving most of the refugees, and this is why Italy should have the most interest to negotiate hard on the reform of the European asylum system, which at the moment is not working for refugees who are prevented from joining families, from reaching communities where they would have the best chance to thrive and integrate. And instead, Italy is putting up obstacles and almost refused to go to the mini summit on Sunday until Angela Merkel begged them to go on the assumption that no deal would be struck. And it is puzzling how Italy is not seeing that the best interest for them is actually negotiate and trying to strike a deal on how to achieve a redistribution of refugees, which is good for refugees and allows all countries to share the inevitable costs of integration.
They're not necessarily refugees, they're economic migrants. You're misrepresenting the main inflows of people into Europe. People are coming here for economic reasons. It's not refugees, it's not women and children avoiding conflict. It is mainly young men trying to get a better future.
But they're all getting lumped in together, aren't they?
Well, the genuine refugees, asylum seekers, would actually be a very small percentage of this. Most people are coming here to better their lives, and understandably so. But, of course, this is creating divisions in Europe, but it's actually not helping the countries they're leaving, that they're in many cases leaving for economic reasons, and it's actually allowing people to come here to be exploited in the black market economy will actually be very detrimental to them. And on the way here, people are having the most severe deprivations because Angela Merkel of Germany had an open door policy encouraging people to come, and other countries in Europe are taking the burden which her policy failures have created.
Let me bring you in, Paul. What is your view on the flow of migrants into Europe? That there are simply too many of them, and there has to be a much tougher solution to that.
Well, look at a couple of the core statistics here. Right now, it is correct that we probably have a majority of economic migrants seeking better opportunities, but there are still among them many refugees from countries like Somalia, from countries like Eritrea, and their dilemma is that all legal pathways to seek asylum, if they aren't safe where they are being closed. And so we do need an approach that takes both of these into account.
But do you understand Italy's concern and those frontline countries like Italy and Greece who are saying that they are bearing the brunt of this and there needs to be a fairer policy across Europe?
Certainly, and that's why the relocation program we started with shortcomings. What's the best thing we've seen around for a while? Precisely because it did that. Italy has a genuine concern and legitimate concern that they haven't received enough support. They bear the brunt. Of course, they cannot refuse ships docking for people that have been rescued at sea. That's a violation of maritime law, but an expression of the unreasonable policy that the rest of Europe has pursued, not coming to their assistance, including my own country, who at one stage relocates and the next month sent people back to Italy under the Dublin Accords, which it has the right to, but it's not obliged to.
Why is this still such a huge issue? I thought the number of refugees coming to Europe had actually fallen because of various deals that have been done.
Absolutely. If I may, it's true that Italy has welcomed so many and rescued so many, but the current government is speaking as if we were back in 2015. At the moment, in these first 6 months, Italy has received 85% less than in the same period last year. So really, we are talking about 15,000 people arriving, of which I must say the first nationality is Eritrean, about 2,500 Eritreans, which are prima facie refugees in Europe. So really it's a perfectly manageable situation.
But what about Robert's point that a lot of these people are economic migrants? They're not people fleeing war and conflict and a threat to their lives.
That is true, and that is a result of the fact that Italy has been sealed for economic migration for a long time. So we also need to look at that. And what European countries are doing is just completely shutting all legal ways into Europe. We have advocated for a long time for more humanitarian visas, but also more work visas, university student visas. There should be more opportunity for people to come and go back to their country.
There is many opportunities for this, and people do come. The issue is, are we going to take people legally via established routes, choosing who we would want to take for economic reasons, our own economic reasons, or of course those who we feel can fit in and contribute to our society. But this isn't a question of those legal routes which do exist. This is people crossing borders, coming, often in some cases, you mentioned people being rescued. In many cases, they're not being rescued. It's believed in Italy, in Italian politics, in Italian media, that many of these aid agencies are actually in cahoots with the people smugglers and picking people up in the Mediterranean and cooperating with them and doing their job for them. This has been widely reported. So it's not people being rescued, it's
go on, Paul.
Working with illegal immigration.
This is going very much off track. Some of the people on the Aquarius that was mentioned were actually picked up by US Navy ships. It's been a big effort by the Italian Coast Guard to rescue people. You shouldn't blame the Italian Coast Guard for being people smugglers. You shouldn't blame merchant ships that have also rescued people.
I'm blaming the NGOs that are working with the people smugglers to bring people into Europe. That has been widely reported. That's the people I'm blaming. So you don't say I'm blaming the Italian Navy, I'm blaming the aid agencies.
But they are operating in the same area. There's a lot of cooperation between the Italian Coast Guard and the NGOs, so this is simply not true. And the example we had previously, when we had Mare Nostrum, under also Italian leadership, they asked for more European support. They didn't get it. They cut down on their rescue efforts, and a lot more people drowned. So the price, if you don't rescue people, is that they drown. And the whole idea that
they're not being rescued.
The NGOs are working together with the boat smugglers, not correct.
I think what this debate is illustrating is that although migration numbers have significantly dropped since the height of the refugee crisis in 2014-15, what's changed is that European countries now have much more infrastructure and systems to try and stop migration. So at the height of the crisis, European countries didn't know what to do. Because of the Schengen Accords, there was very little border enforcement within Europe. There was no coherent European response to boats crossing the Mediterranean. Now that there are national and international organisations working in the Mediterranean, now that we're seeing the return of borders and physical fortifications on the Balkan route, it means that although the number of migrants is a lot less, it's much more visible.
Is there a divide between the sort of fortress Europe, strong borders, illiberal, doesn't want to let anyone in, and the idea that Europe started with, which was open, cooperative, people can move freely? Is that what we're seeing now?
We are seeing, well, people have been talking about Fortress Europe since the 1970s, that like a castle, it's easy to move around within it, but it's very difficult to get in. Now, this wasn't tested by large-scale migration because there wasn't large-scale migration from Africa into the EEC, and there was a physical border with the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet nations, so there was no movement across there. It's only in 2014-15 that we see large numbers of people trying to get into Europe, and once they were able to cross the external border, it became very easy to move within. Now, even though these countries are still part of the Schengen zone and have technically free movement within, we're seeing a return of physical borders and physical infrastructures designed to halt that movement. So Fortress Europe has moved from being not just an area with a strong external border, but the internal borders are returning as well. So we're seeing isolated.
Isn't that what people want to see? Because we have seen a rise of governments who've been voted into power based on having stronger immigration controls. Paul, isn't it a fair point that people are worried?
I think that is correct, but I think it's also correct for the reason that we didn't manage well the 2015 influx and the perception that this was out of control and a chaos, and people were worried for that. What we saw in Europe 20 years ago when the other Balkan wars, even if that was on our own continent, a completely different willingness by politicians to cooperate, to address the root causes, the conflicts, to secure that people had access to protection, both locally, but also to other countries in Europe. And it's that lack of cooperation that has contributed to this sense among much of the public that this is beyond control. Whereas the movement into Europe these days, refugees and migrants, is actually very small. And of course, the backdrop is that the number of refugees globally, unfortunately, keeps growing because we cannot solve the conflicts. And therefore, if Europe wants to play a larger part in supporting people, such as in Africa, it can only do that legitimately if it also takes a reasonable share of refugees itself.
I mean, is it possible to share them?
Well, this is the key issue. European Union policy has tried to push migrants, which are encouraged to enter Germany and Sweden, trying to push these people onto countries such as Poland and Hungary. EU policy should not be telling sovereign states who they can take and who they shouldn't take. It should be for the national governments to decide. It's not for European unions to use these levers.
Are saying they're refusing to accept any migrants.
Absolutely, they've been elected. These governments have been elected on that mandate. We saw how hundreds of thousands marched through the streets of Warsaw, rejecting just a few relatively small number of migrants being put into their country by the European Union, which is a policy which has been driven by President Macron and, of course, Chancellor Merkel in Germany. Why should these countries accept it? They don't have to. Well, surely that's their sovereign right.
If they're not shared throughout Europe, for example, one of the things they're talking about is offshore processing centres or processing centres set up along the North African coast, stopping these people even getting into Europe. I mean, that sounds quite dubious on humanitarian grounds to a lot of people. What do you think of that?
There is still very little details about these proposals, but similar proposals that have been made in the past are very impractical, and they do smell bad, don't they? It's like a way of avoiding responsibility.
Is this a similar idea to what Australia was doing with Nauru and Papua New Guinea?
We need to see the details of what's proposed.
Surely what smells bad is actually the exploitation and abuse of migrants. If we have an open door policy, as we've had in 2015, and allow millions, literally millions of people to come from countries which can't afford to lose these people. They are exploited on the way at every opportunity, economically and in some cases women and children who are open to abuse. This is widely reported, and just to think that we can help people by opening the borders is actually encouraging people to make dangerous journeys where they will be persecuted along the way. That's the reality.
This is no longer the case. The open door policy has now been abandoned. What we have instead is a very ad hoc system of pushing the European Union's borders to the coast of North Africa or to processing centres in President Erdogan's Turkey, where the EU has struck a very unstable deal which depends on goodwill between Ankara and Brussels. So we don't have the open door policy anymore, which was a failure. It was a disaster which did result in people drowning and resulted in a massive populist right-wing surge in Europe. The system that we have now is, it has its own problems because it's an ad hoc solution of saying, well, let's push the European border across the Mediterranean into countries which have highly unstable governments or no governments at all.
But it works on limiting the migrant flows, so this policy is actually a good one and needs to be extended.
I think
it would have been successful. It's something that we tried before until, of course, there was the war in Libya where the previous regime was overthrown, and then of course the instability came.
Do North African countries want to be dumping grounds for refugees, and how do you guarantee their humanitarian rights, their human rights?
Well, they became dumping grounds for refugees because the message went out that you can go to Germany and go to Sweden, you can go to these countries without any legal requirement to do so, and people then made these perilous journeys where, of course, as I mentioned, they were exploited and abused on the way in many cases, and this is destabilised politics within Europe as well.
What do you make of these, Paul?
No, I think we should remember that those that came in 2015 were to a very large degree Syrians that have already spent 2, 3, 4 years since the start of the war in the neighboring countries of Syria, in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey. They did not receive sufficient assistance. They did not have sufficient access to work to be able to manage on their own. And this is what set off a movement of people that, to start with, did not want to leave Syria. They were forced to leave, but didn't manage in the first country.
They were not exclusively
That's a major
Syrian.
lesson learned. No, but if you look at the European statistics in 2015, those coming across to Greece, the vast majority were from countries in war and conflict, with Syria being the largest group. And then nobody really argues for an open door policy for all migrants and for all refugees. What we want to secure is that the boat smugglers aren't the only service around. And for instance, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has worked on having a safety camp, including evacuations from Libya, of refugees in Niger. And this is a kind of idea that is floating around. We should do this more.
I think it is a fair point that the crisis has been exacerbated by smuggling groups, by human traffickers, all of whom have made this crisis much worse. So when you look at solutions, clearly we're not going to solve the problems of the EU if they can't solve it themselves. The only way to cut down on the number of refugees is to end Middle East conflict and poverty in African countries.
At the moment, we've got a drop in refugee numbers, but this is the eye of the storm. The United Nations estimates that by the end of the century, we could see 5 to 10% of the human race on the move due to war, economic inequality, climate change. Refugees are going to become a new phenomenon. Europe needs to find a solution quickly because the migration crisis is going to return, and in much larger numbers and all across the planet.
Can Europe absorb large numbers of migrants?
Technically, yes, but is the political will there? This is politics. It works like physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And the number of migrants coming into Europe, regardless of where they're from statistically or politically, it's the perception of, frankly, an invasion of Europe by outsiders. A perception of an invasion by migrants is going to result in a nativist backlash against this.
And we've already seen the UK pulling out of the EU because of that.
It was
Could this
partly
happen in other... Yeah, OK, partly because of that. But if that is a factor, and it is a growing factor in other countries. We've seen right-wing governments been elected into power. Also, talk in France, Macron managed to avoid that, but talk in France of pulling out of the EU. Are we going to see more people wanting to pull out of the EU because of this issue?
If we can see what's happening in Sweden, where they have effectively followed an open door policy, and contrary to your previous guest, people are calling for an open door policy, and Chancellor Merkel followed that previously in 2015, and countries such as Hungary, who want to take action to defend their borders and indeed defend the southern border of Europe and defend their culture and their civilization as they know it, which is their legitimate right, are being castigated for not having open borders. But what we see is countries such as Sweden, we see that the Sweden Democrats are about possibly to take power in Sweden. This is a party which has some rather unsavoury roots. They argue that they've reformed themselves now, but they are actually calling for Sweden to come out of the European Union and to have a referendum on that. So this is creating real divisions. So not just Eastern European countries, other countries may well follow Britain's example.
And it doesn't necessarily require far-right, unsavoury governments to come to power. What we saw in Europe, in France, Germany and the Netherlands in 2017 was that the appearance of very nationalist groups means that the mainstream establishment, the centrists, end up adopting a lot of this anti-immigrant rhetoric in order to win back the voters.
It's not anti-immigrant, it's anti-immigration. It's about preserving their own culture, and in these countries that's how they see it, particularly in Hungary. And it's not
I know we obviously all have a lot of opinions, and this clearly sums up exactly why European countries can't agree on a consensus. We'll wait to see what happens at upcoming meetings with the EU. But gentlemen, Elisa, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It was a really interesting discussion, and that's it for this edition of Roundtable. Until next time, bye for now.